Okay, welcome everybody to the second IIDS webinar on politics, economics, and public policy in Nepal. I'm Avidit Acharya and I'll be moderating today's talk. Since we have some new participants, let me repeat some of the remarks I made last time about IIDS and this webinar series. IIDS stands for the Institute for Integrated Development Studies and is a non-partisan, not-for-profit research institute established in 1979 in Kathmandu. The institute has served Nepal through academic research and policy analysis in the last 41 years since its founding, and you can find more about the work of the institute by going to iids.org.np. Now, turning to today's talk, let me now introduce our speaker, Professor Soledad Prillaman. Sole is currently an assistant professor of political science, a colleague of mine here at Stanford University. She earned her PhD in government from Harvard University in 2017 and was a prized postdoctoral research fellow at Oxford University before starting here at Stanford last year. Sole works on the political economy of South Asia broadly with a special focus on women's participation in politics and the economy. She's authored a number of papers on this topic and is currently working on a book titled Why Women Mobilize, Dissecting and Dismantling India's Political Gender Gap. And today she's going to be telling us about her fascinating research on political representation in Nepal and how it has changed in recent decades. So Sole, while you are putting up your slides, let me quickly remind our participants of our ground rules. Please remember to keep your mics muted unless you're invited to speak. This time we're going to encourage everyone to keep their videos on to make things a bit livelier for the presenter. So if you're comfortable to do that, you may turn your videos on. Sole will speak for about 40 minutes, then we'll open it up for questions for about half an hour. And you can send me those questions via chat or use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Please keep your questions short so as to give time to others to ask their questions. And while last time I invited people to ask questions in Nepali if they wish, this time we'll keep it in all in English, since as far as I know, Sole is not yet fluent in Nepali, although correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then we'll end with some brief remarks from Dr. Biswash Gauchan, Executive Director of IIDS. I want to thank both him and Binisha Nepal for their support in putting this together, and Dr. Swarnim Waghale, Chair of the Institute, for his support as well. And finally, Sole, thank you for engaging with us today, even though it's 4 a.m. here in Palo Alto. Okay, so the next 40 minutes are yours, uninterrupted. Take it away.
Great, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Avi, and thank you for having me here. I am really honored to get to present my work in this forum. And even though it's, online, I hope one day to return to Nepal and get to meet all of you in person. So thank you for being here and for engaging with this work. So today I'm going to be presenting a project that is co-authored with several people, Bhishma Busal, who's a member of the government of Nepal, Professor Michael Callen at the London School of Economics, Saad Gulzar, a colleague here at Stanford, Professor Rohini Pande, who's a professor at Yale, and Deepak Singhania, who is actually joining me today. So I've invited him also to chime in response to questions. And this work that I'm going to be presenting is something that we've been working on since 2017, right after the local elections took place. And we finally feel we have our evidence at a point where we can compile it and start to share it, but it is still a work in progress. And so I'm really looking forward to this forum as an opportunity to get feedback from all of you about what we've learned so far, as well as what your thoughts are. But I'm going to be presenting a project that's related to what happened in the local elections in 2017 and what are the implications of that for the future of Nepal's democracy. So we have a large literature about what happens during conflict and revolution, but as stated here in this quote, the social and institutional legacies, the consequences of conflict itself are arguably incredibly important, but something that we have far less information and evidence to support. some things that we do know about the likelihood of democratic stability in response to conflict is that democracies that are born out of revolution are generally more persistent than those that are born out of other forms of conflict transitions. So in a study of 94 democratic transitions, so when countries transitioned into being democracies since 1950 to 2006, 11 of those transitions were a result of some sort of revolution or conflict, and of those 10 have survived as democracies. Whereas of the other 83 that came about through some other form of transition, only 46 have survived, so about half, and 37 have actually reverted back to some form of authoritarian rule. Additionally, we know that peace and democratic durability and stability is more likely when insurgents join as parties after the transition into democracy. And so Isla Matinock, in a study of 110 conflict settlements globally, showed that 33 of the 42 conflicts that permitted militant groups to participate as parties endured for 5 years, whereas only 30 out of 68, so under 50% of those that did not incorporate insurgent parties endured for 5 years. And so all of this gives us the idea that conflict born out of revolution, and particularly revolution that integrates insurgent parties, has the likelihood of sustaining and being more durable, which is part of what we want to study in the case of Nepal. And what does that process actually look like? And what are the mechanisms that might underlie that democratic stability? Additionally, there is a distinct literature that looks at the causes of revolutions itself. So what is it that underlies revolution? And there have been 3 historical explanations for this. The first is inequality and class conflict. The second is ethnic diversity and ethnic conflict. And the third is simply opportunities or conditions that might favor revolution. And generally, people have argued that ethnicity actually plays very little role in determining when and where revolutions take place. With studies showing that ethnic fractionalization globally is not particularly predictive of conflict and revolution incidents. However, recently studies have shown that it's not actually ethnic diversity that matters, but the way that ethnic diversity interacts with things like class and inequality that might lead to different ethnopolitical configurations of power that sort of form the seeds of revolution. But this leaves an open question linking these 2 literatures, one that looks at what are the consequences of revolutions for democratic stability, and the other which is what role does ethnicity play in the onset of revolutions? And it leads to a question which is, how do revolutionary movements actually change the ethnic power structure within democracies? And does that actually affect the likelihood of durability and stability of democracy post-conflict? So I won't spend a lot of time talking about the context today, although I have some slides here because I know everyone in this room is likely has greater expertise than I do on all of this. But we're going to be focusing the study today in Nepal, which is a country that's ripe for this sort of analysis, where there were 240 years of monarchy and then the transition to a federal democratic republic in 2017. And we're really going to be focusing on the elections that happened in 2017. And we're going to be looking at the role that ethnicity played both during the revolution and afterwards in terms of the distribution of power. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the role that Janjatis have played both as the backbone of the Maoist-led protests and insurgency, as well as what role that ethnic group has had in the democratic transition afterwards. And to do this, I'm going to focus on 4 sources of data that are going to provide us with a series of facts that we think are really interesting to understand the current state, or at least the state in 2017 in Nepal's democracy. So first, we have administrative census data on all individuals covering 15% of Nepal. So 11 districts in Nepal, we have a census of all individuals. And we're going to link this with 2 forms of political data, electoral data. The first are lists of all candidates and elected representatives in the 2017 local electives But then in addition, we've added to that data from the three major parties, Maoist, UML, and Nepali Congress, on all of the people that they considered for nomination internally, but did not actually nominate. So we can look at three different stages of election. And then we're going to supplement this with a survey that we did in 2019 of party selection committee members from those three parties. So the people who actually made the decisions of who to nominate for candidacy in the 2017 elections. And then finally, we're going to look at the impact of these elections on the receipt of earthquake reconstruction grants as an indicator of impact of does changes in electoral representation actually matter for policy outcomes. And these data will allow us to ask three key questions. So the first is, what are the political consequences of the revolution? And specifically, did the Maoist revolution succeed in creating a pathway for historically excluded groups, specifically Janjatis, to gain political representation? We're then going to try to understand why it is that we would see changes in power structures post-revolution. And specifically, we're going to look at the role that political parties play as gatekeepers. How do party elites influence political representation? And is there any role for discrimination or bias by party elites? And then finally, we're going to look at the impacts of changes in representation for actual policy outcomes by diverse populations. Specifically, did the political representation of Janjatis change policy? So I'm going to start with a little bit of context. Again, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about context, but I'll sort of go through just some key facts that are useful to set up the study. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about what actually do we see in terms of who in Nepal actually became a politician, both in terms of ethnic diversity, but also in terms of things like income and education. Then I'm going to turn to the role that parties have played in the process of shaping who it is that became a politician in Nepal's elections. And then finally, I'll look at those policy impacts that I've mentioned. Okay. So just some very quick context. As I've mentioned, the focus of this study is going to be on the representation of Janjatis. That's for two reasons. One is that we have seen Janjatis to be a historically excluded group politically and economically, and that these indigenous ethnic groups were sort of classified historically as middle caste. Dalits are also a group that we will consider today, and we're going to compare Janjatis and Dalits to sort of an aggregated set of Brahmin, Kshatris, and Newars. But I'd be, very open in Q&A to hear all of your thoughts on how we're categorizing ethnic groups and seeing this. The other reason, as I'll explain in a second and show some evidence for, is the particular role that Janjati seemed to play in the strategy of Maoists during the revolution in terms of which groups they elevated throughout the revolution itself. So just a really quick timeline. Again, I know that for this audience, none of this is particularly useful, but I'll have a couple of figures that might be of interest. So all of this started in 1990 when there was the lift in the ban on political parties within the monarchy to enable what was a constitutional monarchy. And so this started in 1992 with local elections, for which we have some data that I'll show you in a bit about what representation looked like in those 92 elections. Then from 96 to 2006, there was the Armed People's War by the Maoists. And as we see it, sort of three coalitions. There's the monarchy that wanted to retain full control. Mainstream parties such as the Nepali Congress and UML that fought for a constitutional monarchy. And then the Maoists that tapped specifically into Janjati demands through various mechanisms and existing institutions that tried to increase and elevate the status of those groups. And demanded sort of a full republic with no role for the monarchy. And we see from the evidence that we've derived so far, the Maoists mobilized a lot of support from Janjatis and sought specifically greater political incorporation of this group. So a few pieces of evidence that underlie this. So in the early 2000s, out of 30 members of the Maoist Interim Central Committee, 20 of those were Janjati or Dalit, and there was an explicit aim to dilute the elite leadership image and ensure that that looked more representative of what the population of Nepal looked like. Additionally, we've collected data on the members of people's governments, the Maoist people's governments that were put in place during the revolution itself in areas that they had control. So district committee members, and in one district, we have a list of all of the members at the VDC level during the conflict itself. And we've categorized all of these people's committee members across these 5 main ethnic groups. And what we see is while there is, and this figure here reports the caste breakdown, so the population shares of these people government committee members. And so while we see that there's a lot of Brahmins as part of these people's government committees, the largest ethnic group within the Maoist people government during the revolution were Janjatis. Additionally, we've collected some data on the victims during the conflict on all sides. And this here again is the distribution of ethnic identity of the conflict victims from across all of Nepal. And what we see is that, again, the largest ethnic group were Janjatis in terms of consequence. Now, this actually maps quite closely to their population share, but still just wanted to make this note. Then in 2005 and 2006, there's a peace agreement. The Maoists then won the Constituent Assembly in 2008. Important for our later policy impacts, we will be looking at the earthquake that happened in 2015. And then we're going to focus our study very specifically on the 2017 federal elections. And specifically, we're going to be looking at local level elections, those both at the ward level and at the municipality level. We won't be presenting any evidence on elections that happened at higher levels, although we do have that data as well. And the reason that we're going to focus on these local elections is because of the role that these municipalities and wards played and were allocated in both policy implementation and in political, through the devolution of power, their political role. And so within the municipalities, we're going to be looking at mayors and deputy mayors who are responsible for things like preparing budgets, executing decisions in municipal councils, overseeing municipal and ward subcommittees, and managing complaints related to public service delivery. And then we're also going to be looking at wards that are headed by ward chair people and have 4 ward members, 2 of which are reserved seats, 1 for a woman and 1 for a Dalit woman. And wards prepare budgets and programs to be approved by municipalities and then can actually implement at the ward level. Now, often I'm going to, while we've looked at all of these various positions individually, I'm gonna subset a lot of the analysis to what we're deeming leadership positions, i.e. the mayor in the municipality and the ward chairperson in the, at the ward level. And this is both because we see the greatest amount of competition electorally for these seats, and sort of the greatest deviances for these higher authority positions. But again, I would be very happy in the Q&A to hear all of your thoughts on how we are breaking this down. We also, hopefully in a future paper, will be looking at some of the gender consequences that came about as a result of the way that both reservations and sort of the quota around mayors and deputy mayors were implemented, because we do see some interesting deviances based on gender, but we'll reserve that for another time. Specifically, we're going to be thinking about political selection within the 2017 elections, and we're going to focus on the 3 main parties in the elections: the Nepali Congress, the UML, and the Maoists. Within these elections, no party had primaries, and party selection committees were the ones who chose which candidates to nominate for candidacy. And so, as I mentioned, we have lists at all 3 stages of political selection. So we have lists of people who were considered for nomination, we have people who were nominated as candidates, and then we know who actually won the election and became representatives for these 3 parties. And so as we see this, we have sort of 3 stages in the political selection process. The first is that general party committees nominate people and candidates from their village to be considered for candidacy. And of this list, we have 22,000 nominees across the 3 parties. And again, I should have mentioned that we're going to focus our analysis in 11 districts where we have that census data. And it's only for those 11 districts that we have these complete potential nominee lists. Then party selection committees awarded tickets, so who they actually nominated for candidacy, that we see as stage 2. And there we have about 18,600 candidates. And then in third stage, voters still elected politicians and selected who they wanted as their representatives in first past the post elections. And we have about 5,000 elected representatives. There's both significant variation by party and position on whether more than one nominee was put forward by the General Party Committee. So whether or not the first stage of this process was actually competitive. But what we saw was that leadership positions, as we've categorized them, the mayor and the ward chairperson, were substantially more likely to be competitive, both at stage 1 and stage 2 than non-leadership positions, which is why we're going to focus a lot of our analysis there. And so just to give a little bit more detail on the data that we're going to exploit for the rest of this study. So first, as I've mentioned already, we have this electoral data as well as the census data. So to talk a little bit about the census data that we're using, in 2016, there was a census survey done following the earthquake to map all of the Nepalis living in the 11 most earthquake affected districts. Which covers a total of about 3.7 million Nepalis, of which about 2.5 are voting age. And we have data on all of these Nepalis, including their economic position, their education level, as well as their caste. In addition, we have these lists of both potential nominees, candidates, and representatives from the 3 main parties in 2017. And we're going to link these 2 data sources to see who of the 3.7 million Nepalis, 2.56 of whom are voting age, actually ended up running for office and winning elected office. Additionally, to supplement this and try to understand the mechanisms a bit in more detail, we conducted a survey in person in early 2019 when we were able to do things in person, where we collected lists of all of the party members who served on the selection committees at both the district and municipality level. So those who picked municipality candidates and those who picked ward level candidates from the 3 main parties in those 11 districts. And of those complete lists of about 1,500 committee members, we randomly sampled about 800 of them to do a survey with. And then finally, to look at policy impacts, we're going to leverage data on who received earthquake reconstruction transfers from 2015 to 2019. And so for this, in those 11 districts, we have lists of all beneficiaries, dates, and amounts of the earthquake transfers that they received, that again, we're able to link with the other data sources that we have. And if, I know that there's no interruptions, but if any clarification is useful, again, my colleague and co-author Deepak is here, and so I'm sure would be happy to help over chat if there's anything that is particularly unclear. Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about who it is that actually became a politician. So we have a lot of evidence, say in the US or a big paper in Sweden that shows, that people who become elected politicians are substantially higher income and usually higher education relative to the general population. And we wanted to understand, what does political selection look like in Nepal? And so to do this, we merged the census data that I've mentioned from those 11 districts with the election data using name and location and a few other identifiers. And we had about 80% success, which we've been able to validate as well to show that there's sort of no substantial bias in that. And we wanted to compare both the caste distribution as well as the distribution of things like education and income of the voting age population with that distribution of politicians. And again, I'm going to be looking at 3 groupings: the nominees, the candidates, and the elected politicians. So I have a series of figures that are going to follow the same format, so I thought I would walk you through what those figures look like to make interpretation a little bit easier. So for these figures, there are a series of black bars with no coloration. These represent the distribution of here caste, and in other cases income and education, in the population from the population census data. So here we can see that just about 50% of the population in these 11 districts are Janjati. And we're sort of categorizing Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Newar as historically elite groups, and then Janjatis and Dalits as historically non-elite groups. And then you'll see a series of light blue bars. In the rest of them, it'll peer through all 5 of these, but for now, I'll just show you this within the Janjati group. These light blue bars represent the distribution for the nominees, those who were considered as potential candidates by the party selection committees. And so we see that just about 45% of all those who were considered within the party selection process were Janjati.
Dr. Bora, I think Dr. Bora has a clarifying question.
Yes.
If you have a clarifying question, go ahead and ask it. Ask it. Do you want to unmute yourself? No, you have to go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just wondering, you said about 40% you're Janjati. What are those 11 districts that you're studying? I was just curious.
So I don't know the names off the top of my head. They're the 11 earthquake affected districts, and I should have had a map in here and I don't. I can pull one up for the Q&A to show you those districts. They are sort of more within the central belt of Nepal, and so are not particularly representative necessarily, particularly on some of these indicators of the rest of Nepal, but are the ones that were most earthquake affected. I'll try to find a map for the Q&A to show you exactly which those are.
Yeah, just the only reason I'm asking that is to see if there was any ethnic composition imbalance in terms of population representation. That's all.
One thing I can say about that is that so we have the list of all candidates and all representatives from the entire country. It's just the census and the potential nominees that we only have for those 11 districts. And we do even have through sort of broader censuses. We don't have individual level data, but we have sort of broader population distributions from the rest of Nepal. And so while the black bars will look different, so the population distribution will be different when you look at Nepal as a whole. What I can say is that we've explored how the relative distribution, so the distribution of these black bars relative to the blue bars are. Sorry, I was muted. Apologies for the pause. What I can say is that the relative distributions actually do look the same when you look at all of Nepal as opposed to these 11 districts. And so what we see here just from this one blue bar that I'm pointing to on my other screen, but you cannot see, you see more in front of you, is that the Janjatis as potential nominees were relatively underrepresented, although not largely underrepresented, relative to their population share. If they were perfectly represented, we would expect this blue bar to be at the same height as the black bar. Then there will be sort of this middle sort of blue bar, and that's going to represent the distribution of candidates, those who actually contested office and ran for office. And then finally, the dark blue bars are going to represent the distribution of actually elected representatives. And so we can look, for example, at the distribution of Dalits. And what we see is that at all 3 stages of the electoral process, there's overrepresentation of Dalits relative to their population share. Now, this is not particularly surprising, given that there were reservations for Dalits at the ward level. And right now I'm lumping all positions together. And so if you take out the ward member seats that were reserved for Dalits, this overrepresentation disappears. We also see that elite castes were generally underrepresented relative to their population shares, but actually overall, there's fairly even representation where sort of across all ethnic groups, all parties, all positions, you see that there's sort of more fairly consistent representation that matches population shares. Now, again, this is for all positions and the 3 parties that we have. We're going to break this down by leadership party where you'll see some differences. So here I'm presenting a figure of these distributions for just the leadership positions, which are the mayor and the ward chairperson, distinguishing by these 3 parties. And this is, again, the ethnic distribution. So the first thing I wanted to note is that in leadership positions, the Dalit position is substantially underrepresented. So we have very few Dalits who are elected as ward chairperson or as mayor, or even considered for candidacy. Additionally, what we can see is that across all three parties, there is an overrepresentation of these historically elite caste groups, particularly Chhatris, and that this overrepresentation is largest for the UML and the Nepali Congress. And then finally, to draw your focus on the Janjati distribution, what we see is while there is fairly high both nomination, candidacy, and representation of Janjatis across all three groups, particularly the UML were underrepresented in both the nomination and election of Janjatis, and the Maoists had, if anything, overrepresentation of Janjatis, both in their nomination as well as specifically in those who ultimately got elected. There was greater selection of Janjatis amongst those who were elected by voters than there was by parties in the party selection process. And I wanted to suggest that I've kind of been talking about this as being something that might have changed as a result of the conflict, the revolution, the democratic transition process. But right now I've only presented evidence from 2017 itself. And so I wanted to show that this marks a deviance from the local elections that happened in both 1992 and 97. And while we don't have lists of all of those potential nominees who were considered for candidacy in those elections, we do have those who contested office and ultimately won office. And so what we can do is we can compare the caste distribution of elected candidates and elected representatives in 92, 97, and 2017 for VDC chair people and ward chair people. And what we see is that there is a substantial underrepresentation of Janjatis across all parties in 92 and 97, with overrepresentation of historically elite castes, and again, underrepresentation of Dalits across all three, but that there is a substantially higher share of Janjatis within the political elite and political class in 2017. Additionally, we wanted to look at not just what does the ethnic distribution of politicians look like, but what does the education and income profile of those who won office. And with the specific question of, often we'd like to think that the people who are elected are those that are both most capable and most able to fill these positions and most competent. We don't have great measures of what ability in these positions might be, but we do have measures like education, which may, be a sort of proxy for ability. And so here what I have is the same distributions in that there's the population shares, nominees, candidates, and elected representatives. But instead of caste, we're looking at the education distributions across the three main parties and 4 leadership positions. And again, the black bars are the distributions in the population of education. And so what we see here is that across all 3 parties, there is substantial positive selection, meaning that those who are considered for candidacy, who are candidates and then who win office, are substantially more educated, i.e. far more likely to be of class 11 or class 12 or have a bachelor's degree or higher than the population itself. So for example, about 28% of the population is illiterate and only about 5% of Nepali Congress elected officials in leadership positions are, and that's about the same across all 3 parties. I think another interesting thing to note is that the parties, so remember these blue bars are who are being proposed to party selection committees, and then the middle blue bars are those whom the parties are choosing to then put forward as candidates. What we see is the parties are doing playing a fairly important role in selecting highly educated people to put forward as candidates. And we see this across all 3 parties where there's the distribution of candidates looks even more positively skewed than the distribution of potential candidates. And this is specifically if we were to look only at the group of Janjatis in the population, as well as amongst those that are considered for candidacy and election. This is those distributions only for Janjatis. There might be a concern that the underrepresentation of Janjatis is because of historical inequalities in access to education. And so we wanted to look at, are the Janjatis that are being elected or that are being involved in the elections, are they as positively selected on education as the rest of the political class? And what we see is that there is still substantial positive selection on education for Janjati politicians across all three parties, but even most so within the Nepali Congress. So then what we wanted to do was evaluate exactly that question, which is, is the historical exclusion of Janjatis a function of, say, disinclination against Janjatis, or is it a function of existing inequalities that may underlie, that may correlate with the ethnic distribution in terms of education, income, and other proxies for ability? And so we ran a series of regressions, and I'm going to go through things quickly as I realize my time is running low, to evaluate and compare the candidate's caste relative to, and then their likelihood of being selected. So the outcome variable here is whether or not you were nominated as a potential candidate, whether or not you became a candidate, and whether or not you were elected as a representative relative to the entire population. So here, as you see in the number of observations, we have the entire population included in these models. And we're going to look at how caste and how things like education, income, and asset predict your likelihood of being selected for these offices. So the first thing I want to note is down at the bottom. So in general, about 3 in 1,000 Janjatis were nominated for to be considered for political office. So we're even considered. So 3 in 1,000 is sort of the base. And we see that for Brahmin, Kshetra, and Newars, that's about 3.7 in 1,000. Additionally, I want to draw attention to this figure here, which says when we don't account for things like education, income, and assets, that Janjatis that are not from the dominant caste, so when they're in a community where Janjatis are not the largest and most populous caste, they're 16% less likely than Brahmin, Kshetra, and Newars, who are also not from the dominant caste, to be nominated for a position. However, this is much smaller, only about, I'll just give you the figure, about 2.3% less likely when they are a member of the dominant caste relative to Brahmin, Kshetra, and Newars, who are a member of the dominant caste. But then when we control for things like education, income, and assets, this sort of discount Janjatis are given reduces substantially, although is still sort of apparent, at least when they're non-dominant caste members. And then when we look at candidacy and representation, again, the discount exists, but as soon as you control for education and income and assets, it disappears and is no longer significant when a non-dominant caste or a dominant caste, meaning that once we account for characteristics like education and income, Janjatis are as likely as Brahmins, Kshetras, and Newars to be elected as representatives and to be chosen as candidates themselves. We looked at this also by party, and we see that, again, these figures look the same across all three parties. However, the Maoists had zero discrimination, or sort of there was no penalty for being a Janjati even in the nomination stage, although otherwise the results look the same across the parties. Okay. So in summary, what we see is that Janjatis gained representation in leadership positions relative to their representation in the 92 and 97 elections, but that we still see this large positive selection on proxies of ability like education, and that conditional on ability, things like, again, education, income, and assets, Janjatis are as likely to be chosen as a party candidate and to be elected as historically elite castes. But we see that Janjati representation in leadership positions is higher from the Maoist party. So we wanted to understand how these gains in representation were achieved. And again, I'm going to move quite quickly because I know I'm running out of time. but we'll try to get through as much of this as I can, and happy to circulate or have conversations later to cover other things. So we wanted to understand, what role do these party selection committees play in shaping the distribution of candidates? And so we looked at the list that we had of these selection committee members, and we did a survey of about 700 of these committee members, which is about an 80% response rate, which was done in person. And first, we wanted to see who are on these committee members. So if these are the gatekeepers to elected office, who are the people who are the gatekeepers themselves? So looking at, for the entire set of selection committee members. So remember, these are no longer the politicians or people considered office. These are the set of people who are choosing who's considered office. What we have here are the committee members, or the first 3 bars. The distribution, the share that are female, Janjati here, Dalit here, and Brahmin, Kshatriya and Newar here. And then in green, just as comparison, we have the politician leadership position and all member distribution here as a comparison. And so what we see is that there are very few women on these committees, and in leadership positions, very few elected politicians, that they're far less likely to be on these selection committees to be Janjati, but that the Maoist and UML see a larger share of these committees that are Janjati, and they're much more likely to be from historically elite groups. And these distributions are even more, sorry, I was muted again, even more distinct than the politician distribution. And just in case it's of interest, I thought I would share what the distribution of income education and an indicator of being highly educated, so greater than class 11. And what we see is that committee members have substantially higher income than even politicians. They have higher education as well than politicians. And I should have mentioned, these yellow bars are the population. So substantially higher averages than the population. So then the question is, does the identity of these committee members matter for who they select as office? And so what we looked at is we ran a regression model that compared the share of the committee that was Janjati with the share of the nominee pool, so those who were even considered, not those who were selected, but those who were even considered who were Janjati. And what we see is that there's a significant and positive correlation between the ethnic composition of the party selection committee and the ethnic composition of the nomination pool that was considered. Although this sort of diminishes when you consider other covariates, such as whether or not Janjatis are the dominant caste group, as well as things like education of committee members, it still remains positive and significant. And this is separating by party, that there's still a positive and significant effect across all 3 parties, but the Maoist party has a substantially larger effect, meaning that when you have more Janjatis on a Maoist party selection committee, you're even more likely than for the other parties to select Janjatis, to have Janjatis in your nomination pool. So what we see is that Janjati nominees are more likely to be considered by a committee when there are more Janjati members. Now, this could be something about, there are many reasons that could underlie this, including the fact that just knowing who is on the committee may make Janjati potential candidates put their names forward in the race. And so it's not necessarily an indicator of whether or not there's bias through these committees at all. But one thing to note is that 60% of Maoist nominees are Janjatis, as compared to only 42% for the UML and 26% for the Nepali Congress. The next thing that we did, and again, Avi, please feel free to cut me off. I know I'm about to run out of time, so I'm going to try and take maybe 5 minutes to
Yeah, I think you can. I think that's fine. Go ahead.
So I'll talk very quickly, but one of the things that we did in the survey is we ran what was an implicit association test with these party committee members. And this implicit association test is attempts to measure some form of implicit bias. It's imperfect in doing this, but it has respondents rapidly classify a series of stimuli that represent both Tamang, so a particular group of Janjatis, and Brahmins with categories of leadership. And the idea is that if you are able to more quickly associate, let's say, Brahmins with leaderships, that you may have at least an implicit association between those two categories, if that's, say, faster than your speed at which you associate Tamangs with leadership. So to give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, is our respondents to our survey were read a series of last names first and asked to categorize these into the two ethnic categories, Brahmin and Tamang. And then after they sort of got used to doing this, we randomly assigned leadership words with one side. So in this case, leadership was on the left alongside with Brahmin, and they would see a series of last names they had to categorize, and then they would see a series of words associated with leadership that they also had to categorize correctly. Something like confident might be a word they would see about leadership. Then they would do another round where it would reverse, and leadership was now on the side with Tamang. And the goal is to see, are they faster at categorizing words like confident when leadership is on the right side, when it's alongside Tamang, versus when it's on the left side with Brahmin. All of these things are randomized so that, you know, the ordering of where it is varied by respondent, so we can account for those sorts of effects. And so what we wanted to see is, first, what determines bias and implicit associations? We did see high levels of sort of implicit bias, if that's what we can call it, amongst committee members from all parties, meaning that there was sort of much easier association of Brahmins with leadership positions than there was with Tamangs with leadership positions. And here we wanted to look at, well, how does the identity of the committee member affect their sort of associated bias and implicit associations? And what we see is that Janjati committee members are less likely to associate Brahmins with leadership roles quickly through this IAT measure, as well as the more educated you are, the less likely you are to have this sort of Brahmin bias. And we saw that this is particularly, that there's less of this Brahmin bias within both Maoist and UML parties. Particularly, sorry, I should say only amongst those who are also themselves Janjati. There's no difference across party members for those who are themselves from historically elite groups. And I won't spend much time explaining this table, but simply to say we looked at whether or not this bias actually predicted who they selected to be candidates. And what we found is that it didn't have a lot of predictive power, except in how it affected the way that education was considered. And what we saw is that people who were sort of pro-Tamang or had less of the Brahmin bias gave a larger education premium to Janjati nominees, meaning that Janjati nominees who had higher education were substantially more likely to be selected by those who had less pro-Brahmin bias. Okay. So the very last thing I will go through quickly, which I should be able to do quite quickly, is whether or not the distribution of politicians actually affected policy outcomes in the future. And so for this, I'm going to use the actual earthquake transfers that were made starting in 2015 all the way to 2019. And as a reminder, we have the list of all people in these 11 districts who received any of these earthquake reconstruction grants, which were given to a set of people based on eligibility criterion from the survey that was done. But what we're going to leverage is the fact that mayors and ward chairs after their election in 2017 were given responsibility for the administration of these earthquake transfers through a variety of ways. So they were allowed to provide construction permits. Ward chairs, for example, were allowed to recommend people who may have been missing from the initial eligibility lists and change eligibility categories, as well as to register grievances and move that forward. So we're going to look specifically at, does the identity of the ward chairperson matter for both who gets earthquake benefits and how many people get earthquake benefits in general. And so first, to do this, we use just a basic OLS regression, looking at, again, we have the population of people who receive benefits, and we wanted to see what are the predictors of who it is who gets benefits. So as you would hope, people who are eligible for benefits are substantially more likely to receive earthquake transfers. Additionally, we wanted to look at how does the education level of the elected official, of the ward chair, affect how many people and the amount of money that is spent on relief transfers. And what we see specifically is that highly elected politicians are better able to deliver transfers to those who are eligible and specific and vulnerable. So we see that there's a substantially higher rate of transfers and the amount of transfers received by those who are eligible when the ward chair has 11th education or higher. And then finally, we wanted to look at, does having the same caste identity as the ward chair matter for the amount of earthquake receipts that are made? And while it's not significant, Janjatis who share the same caste as the representative are more likely relative to Janjatis that don't. There is sort of a positive effect to receive earthquake transfers. And then to just, as a very final piece of evidence, we wanted to use a close election design to study exactly whether or not politician identity matters. And so to do this, what we did is we compared politicians who were just barely elected, so received just over 50% of the vote. It's not 50% in every case, but we're just barely elected, with those who, with communities that had someone who was just barely elected of a different group. And we're going to compare 3 different groups. We're going to compare having a highly educated person relative to having a lower educated person, having a Janjati politician relative to a Brahmin Chetwar Newar politician, as well as having a Janjati politician who shares your surname relative to a Janjati politician who does not share your surname. And I won't talk through what all of this says specifically for time's sake. Here is the education regression discontinuity that we ran. But what you can see, though, with very significant is that having a higher educated politician increases both the number of people who receive benefits and the total size of benefits received significantly. So educated politicians are delivering more benefits and benefits to more people. We, however, don't see any effect of having a Janjati politician relative to a Brahmin Chetwar and Newar, that Janjati politicians are delivering about the exact same amount of benefits to Janjati constituents as Brahmin Chetwar and Newar politicians are. However, there's a small, although not particularly robust, effect of having a Janjati politician who shares your surname. So if you share the surname with a politician, you're slightly more likely to receive benefits than if you don't share the surname with the politician. And so apologies for sort of rushing through this. I'm very happy to go through all of this in more detail offline. But just as a quick conclusion, what we see as what we're trying to show here in the picture we're trying to paint is that the entry of the revolution itself, or at least the entry of an insurgent group through the Maoists, led to a greater representation of Janjatis in the political class after the election, while still maintaining overall positive selection and high education of politicians relative to the population. And we see that education in particular matters in terms of politicians' ability to deliver services, and that highly educated politicians are better able to redistribute earthquake transfers, and that these gains are in part attributable to a less elite and less biased nature of Maoist party leadership in terms of who they were choosing as candidates. But this leaves open, as we see it, there are several open questions that we hope to continue to explore, including what are the long-run consequences and the evolution of identity politics in sort of subsequent elections and as democracy sustains. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm really looking forward to any comments or questions or suggestions that you all have, and thank you for bearing with me through that.
Okay, thank you, Soleil. Thanks so much for this really interesting talk. We have a lot of questions that came in through the chat, and Deepak did well in answering a lot of the clarifying questions, but I think there are still some outstanding. So why don't we go through those somewhat quickly before we allow people to unmute themselves and ask their follow-up questions. So I'll moderate this. So we had a question from Professor Dhamala, who says that he would like to further ask who became a politician, even elected as an MP or nominated as a minister of Nepal. And I actually had a very closely related question, which is that your data are from the ward and municipality level, although you said you had data at the higher levels as well, which you didn't present. Is there any evidence on how caste representation varies with political rank within the party? Because the conventional wisdom is that as you go higher up in sort of the higher echelons of party leadership, it gets less diverse.
So I can speak to this, I think, pretty quickly, and this is something that I think we could explore even more. So the first is to say that precisely what you said, Avi, is true even at the local level. So ward members look more ethnically diverse than ward chair people, and ward chair people look more ethnically diverse than mayors. And so we see that as the hierarchical political position goes up, that the ethnic distribution becomes more skewed towards elite caste groups. I believe, although it's been a little while since I've looked at the figures, I believe that is true also at the state level. I'm not sure if we've looked at this at the MP level, although I need to, sorry, I shouldn't have said I should look at this at the MP level. I believe that it is true there too. And I actually think that what we saw was that higher levels of office looked much more closely like the distribution of party committee members that I showed, which was substantially more skewed than the politicians themselves.
Okay, thanks for that answer. If anybody has a follow-up question to that, we can get to it after we get through some of these questions in the chat. So Dr. Chandra Upadhyay says it's a big study, thank you. However, can you please tell us something about focusing on the post-revolutionary evolution of political class and the 11 sampled districts? And I suppose the question comes from, so I suppose the issue here is that, since this study is post-earthquake, this raises the question of whether there was an earthquake effect on representation that you wouldn't see in districts that were not as severely hit, maybe because parties felt they needed to be more representative in those districts to be electorally viable. And I think Vinish also had the same question, so a lot of people asked this.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I have a few things I can say to that. Really quickly, I should have also added in my answer to the last question, just something that I find really interesting, is that you do see things actually look very different if you look at women, positions mostly held by women in terms of representation, which is in part why we focused on leadership positions. I don't think it's as, I think people may know here, but about 98% of mayors are men, even though one of the mayor or deputy mayor had to be a woman. And so deputy mayoral positions actually look quite different from mayoral positions. Moving to this question though about, is this an earthquake effect? Is this a revolution effect? Or is this simply a new democracy effect? All of which are possible. So I think two things I can say to this right now. The first is we did look at the distribution of the caste of politicians across all of Nepal, not just these elected 11 districts. Although, as a reminder, we don't have the potential nominees and we don't have the survey. We only have the candidates and elected officials. And what we see is that the relative distributions, I believe, of these three main parties look about the same. What I don't know off the top of my head is when you bring in other parties, and I know other parties have more dominance in other regions of Nepal, I don't know if they looked the same. So that's something to explore. But I do think that that provides evidence that for these three parties at least, it's not something specific to being in these earthquake affected districts. And we've additionally added in 3 more districts that were sort of more marginally affected by the earthquake, but not as much. And again, the same results hold. The second thing I can say, which speaks to sort of the broader project that we're working on, but was too much to put in here and in a paper, there's so much interesting stuff to understand here that I didn't want to, we've been trying to figure out how much to put together in a single study. But one of the things that we're looking at is trying to understand what are the mechanisms that the revolution and conflict may have had to lead to this. And so we've been comparing areas that were more heavily affected by the conflict with areas that were less affected by the conflict, even within these 11 districts. And we do actually see substantial variation there, that areas that were more heavily affected by conflict, as measured by the number of deaths, saw sort of greater representation of non-elite groups. However, that's we don't quite have sort of causal identification on that particularly well, so there could be other selection effects happening there. But all of that to say, we're working on exploring the mechanisms that would underlie this effect that relates to conflict itself.
Okay, thanks, Soleil. And sort of in that same vein, you know, we have a question from Prithvi Rai, who says, I understand that you've taken Congress, UML, and Maoist parties, but what's your take on the Jasapa party? Because the Janjati candidates are, you know, massively represented in some other parties like that one.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but something that we could put together with the data that we have for all of Nepal. We decided to focus on this right now to make comparison easier and to highlight the areas where there was sort of competition, where where candidates were actually likely to be elected. But I don't know the answer in terms of the distribution of other parties relative to these three, but something we could easily put together.
Okay, I'm just going to read out a couple more of these questions because I know that we're running low on time, and I do want to give people a chance to like unmute themselves and ask their follow-up questions. So Dr. Chandraupadhyay asks, one of my studies with a minority group in Nepal showed that the group's political representation was very poor because the group's leadership quality was divided into 4 different political platforms. How is your understanding, you know, do you have any sense of how political platforms are affecting your results here?
So we haven't looked at political platforms in 2017. That would be an interesting thing to do, and something we haven't collected data on. So I don't actually have an answer to that now, but we'll very happily take the suggestion. Some of the things that we have looked at, in case it's, you know, of interest to anyone, is we've started to explore sort of where these people's governments were located, since, as I mentioned, we have data on people's governments during the conflict. Does that affect the sort of both where you see Janjati representation as well as the combination of education and Janjati representation? But we haven't looked at platforms in the 2017 election, and so I do appreciate that suggestion.
Okay, we have a number of other points. Pushpa Raj Karnikar says that Newars should be included in the Janjati group, and a variety of other points that maybe Deepak can look at in the chat, and if he wants to bring up some questions that you have particular answers for, then we can do that. But at this point, I want to open it up to any follow-up questions because we have about 10 minutes left from our participants. They want to ask in person.
As a really quick response on the Newar point, we've gone back and forth on them, and it does not affect the results that much.
Go ahead.
But appreciate your point.
Sounds good. Okay, so Swarnim Dai had a very long comment. I don't know, I don't want to read the whole thing out, but if, I also don't want to put him on the spot, but if you want to unmute yourself and basically ask your question, feel free to do so.
No, Avidit, thank you. No, it was just a private comment to you, which you can relate later. I would just, it's a great scholarly contribution. I just wanted to say that when you write up the full paper, some nuance and context would help. For example, there's this whole notion of hysteresis, right? 2006 was not the only revolution Nepal went through. 1950, 1990, a lot of these things build on these previous achievements. So the Nepali Congress, which led all three, although the 2006 was driven by the Maoist agenda, has its own ethnic and education legacies. So these things matter when you add that layers of nuance. Janajatis are not a homogeneous group. The most successful ethnic groups in Nepal, the Newars and the Thakalis, for example, are clubbed as Janajatis. So when you do this dichotomous kind of analysis, elite versus non-elite, there's a lot of blurriness that comes into the picture. The earthquake districts, 11 districts, Tamangs dominate. Right, and that came out, but Tamangs are very unique among the Janajatis because they were never enrolled in the British Army. Another sort of legacy that you have to go back to, when it comes to the so-called martial races, your history of, involvement in the combat movement and all that. Unlike the Magars, Rais, Limbus, so there's all these very textured layers that you might want to come out. Some casual remarks that we had made at the beginning. Maoists were not barred in 1992; they boycotted, and the republic was not a Janajati demand. It was not an ethnic demand at all. It was a purely political demand that matured towards the later stages of the so-called People's War. So these things can be brought up with a overall excellent, fantastic contribution. And this is amazing work, the way you mined the data, the censuses, triangulated them. This is going to be great. Thank you, Soledad.
I really appreciate that feedback, and we'll definitely take that into account. And it's exactly that which we're hoping to do now. So I appreciate all of these remarks as places to go and invest more time and write in. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like Ram has his hand up, so.
Yes, yeah, sorry, I didn't see the way to hand up in the screen, so I just raised my hand. It's a great study. I really appreciate to congratulate to the team, to the authors. I think it's overwhelming to understand in one setting. It's so much econometrics involved with people who are familiar with the methodology and things like that. My basic question here would be, I missed it when you presented because there is so much in it. Now, if you control everything, education, income, and other characteristics that you do, is the mean for the Janajati and Dalit and mean value for the BCN, are those statistically different for selection of the candidate and winning candidate? And how much different? What is the percentage there is statistically difference? What is the percentage even after controlling everything, those attributes, what is the chances that BCN will be overrepresented in those all outcomes? And the second thing is, I think you have done it. I think you have controlled all indirect effect by interacting the variable with the ethnicity. I think which is a great thing. If it is not done, I missed it, some of it. I think you have to control that education and income by interacting with ethnicity as well, because we know these are the indirect and compound effect. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I think, as is being highlighted in the Q&A, one of the challenges that we've had with the study is that there is so much to learn and so much data here. And so, yeah, I apologize for how much we went through, and thank you for coming along. Just in answer to that question, when you control for all of those other factors for which we have data, which are specifically education, income, and assets, what you find is that there is actually no difference between the likelihood that a Janjati is selected relative to a BCN. That's not true for Dalits. Dalits are substantially, that are still less likely to be selected at all three stages, but there's no difference between Janjatis and BCN at all three stages.
Great, thank you.
We had a couple of questions, one on mechanisms and one on the conclusion. I'll read the one on mechanisms first. In what way did the Maoist revolution force these parties to field Janajatis as candidates? What's the causal mechanism here? Is it a strategic decision to field candidates at the local level? And then the question on the conclusion was, how can you attribute the revolution? The implication is the implication that revolution was a necessary event for these gains. Yeah, identity-based movement is now a global phenomenon. How can we be sure that gains would not have been made without the revolution? So let me stop. There's another couple of related questions, but I think that they basically fall in the same category.
Yeah, these are really useful questions, and something that To be honest, we've struggled with a bit because breaking apart these mechanisms empirically has been quite difficult, both from a causal identification standpoint and from a data perspective. And so specifically the answer to the first question about what is the causal mechanism, I don't think we have an answer to that yet, although that's something that we're exploring in another project and working on getting data towards. What I can say is that what we found so far is that there are differences in terms of the election outcomes and the selection process in areas that were more affected by conflict than areas that were less affected by conflict. And again, measuring affected by conflict based on the number of deaths in those wards and municipalities in the conflict itself. Why that is something that we're still not fully clear on. And if anyone has any recommendations on how to distinguish that, I would be extremely open to having conversations. The kinds of things that we're looking at doing is trying to differentiate what conflict meant in various areas. Things like where were there people's governments and what were the distribution of people who were elevated during conflict itself? Did that impact who actually got elected through some sort of political ability and political experience effect, or were there other things that that happened? And I think one way to highlight some of the differences though that we're seeing is that these effects that I'm talking about in conflict affected areas hold only when looking at caste, but not at gender. And so we see that there are different mechanisms underlying various forms of representation. Our sense on the gender side of things is that a lot of the gains were across Nepal, across all regions, which I don't want to say too much now because these are things we're still exploring and I lack enough expertise in, and I'm sure people here have far more, but that gender gains were largely rooted in the reservations and quota policies that were put in place, which if I understand were much more central. And so we're also trying to look at if we can, what were some of the decision-making processes that happened even within the constituent assemblies and within the peace process itself. So again, any feedback on data sources or ways to take this or possible mechanisms would be incredibly welcomed as this sort of the next stage that we're trying to take this for, so that I can hopefully have an answer to the second question, which is, was revolution actually what drove this, or would this have happened through, you know, the incorporation as well as through democracy on its own?
Okay, there's a question came in from Rashesh on data collection. Maybe Deepak can answer that in the chat. Ashish Bajracharya makes one suggestion, which is on the point that you just made, which is to consider the qualitative work on this topic. What does the qualitative work say, and do you consider it in interpreting your conclusions and findings? I see that Dr. Bora has his hand up. So, Dr. Bora, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, it's fantastic study. I really congratulate the authors for their effort to blend several different types of data set, which is not very easy to do in a country like Nepal. So I really congratulate you on that, and I hope that this paper goes to some really good journal. And I have three observations, a couple of technical and one kind of a conceptual. A couple of technical is that I was wondering if you have considered the idea that income, asset, and education might be endogenously there's some issues with that. So I was wondering if your earlier research would be sensitive to simply using education, because in a way, there's lots of studies that show that the education and income, they kind of feed into each other. So that might be one idea that you might take into account. The other is whether or not you have calculated the marginal effect. A lot of times whenever you have the cross product, and we tend to talk about the effect of the Janjati times education, but then if you were to be interested in finding out about the Janjati, I think the factor with the cross as well as the main effect might be interesting to look at the marginal effect of each factor you're talking about. That's the second question. in terms of your the benefits, I was wondering if you also looked into the idea of social capital, community level social capital. And a lot of times, not just the education or the income or the politicians' attributes, but sometimes the community level social capital also drives how the government funds are allocated or directed. So you might want to look into the social capital aspect as well.
So thank you for those comments. I'll respond quickly as I know we're out of time to that and to the question also about qualitative data. The idea of social capital is where I'll start. I think that's super interesting. It's something that I actually study in different studies quite intensely. And so I love that idea. If you have any idea on how to measure or understand that, I would be very open to your thoughts on that. Right now, we just, our limitations have simply been the data that were included in the census.
Since you're using the, do you have the access to NLS's data? Do you?
I don't believe, I don't know, not as of now.
I think the NLS's data can provide you because we've I've done a few work and measuring the social capital, like the women's participation, forest group. All that information is available in the Living Standard Survey. So you can match that with your census using the whatever the the VDC level ID and capture the social capital. There are 36 different measures. You can create an index out of it, either using the straightforward index, or you can use some sort of a principal component analysis to get the factor. And then you can use that back into your model.
That's a wonderful suggestion. So thank you for that and for that direction on where to go. I will definitely be looking into that. And I think Deepak shared that we have some of this already. So I appreciate that feedback. On the others, I'll simply say these are things we've looked at. And I agree about endogeneity of education, income, and assets. And we've done various things. I won't get into all of them explicitly, but including just looking at education as well as sort of predicting the residual off of a model of just those three to try and get at that. And then I think the last thing that I'll say on this qualitative data is that this is exactly, I think, where this project needs to go, is incorporating more of this qualitative evidence, particularly when we're trying to get at mechanisms. So I appreciate that point. And again, we'll happily take any suggestions. Alongside the survey that we did also ask these committee members a series of qualitative interview questions, as well as interviewing several politicians. And to be honest, I found those to be the most helpful and useful in understanding some of what the underlying mechanisms may be, and something that we're exploring more. And so looking at other qualitative sources and secondary sources as we move forward is exactly where we're going. So thank you for that. And thank you all for your feedback. Please, don't hesitate to reach out if anything more comes up. It would be great to interact offline as well as to hopefully meet all of you one day.
Okay, thank you so much, Sole, for the talk, and thank you also to Deepak for handling so many of the questions that came in chat. I hope you guys are able to take screenshots of the chat because I don't think you can copy and paste off of Zoom. So we're already over time, 4 minutes over time, but I want to invite Dr. Biswash Gauchan to conclude, take a minute to just conclude the webinar today.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Acharya. Let me begin by thanking Professor Acharya for leading and moderating the first 3 events of our monthly webinar series on politics, economy, and public policy. I would like to thank Professor Prillaman and Dr. Singhania for presenting very interesting paper on a very important topic, especially in the very early hours of the morning in the USA. I would like to congratulate her and her co-authors for their amazing work on Nepal's political transition. I've found the outcome of this paper truly revealing, as it helped me broaden my perspectives of the impact of the recent political transition on the social representation of the politics in Nepal. The key findings of this notable work is the greater social representation of the non-elite caste in the last local elections under federal structure compared to previous two elections of 1992 and 1997, accompanied by the choice of the candidates with better income and education profiles, and how such development has positively influenced their policy inclusion in resource allocation relating to the earthquake relief transfers in those 11 most affected districts. Our age-old tradition is deeply rooted on gender-based and caste-based socio-economic values and political structure. This has severely inhibited the social, cultural, and economic transformation of the country. While addressing these long-standing structural issues through the constitution and legal frameworks are very important steps, the reforms that will ensure the equitable access to the quality and higher education and affordable healthcare system and job opportunities are key to the overall socio-economic and political transformation of the country. The latest political development in the country, however, has once again instilled a sense of uncertainty that the country endured since 1994, when the first majority government under the multi-party democratic system dissolved the parliament in a similar fashion. The country cannot afford yet another period of political instability. I am very pleased with the support and contribution of IIDS fellows, particularly Professor Acharya and Professor Bohra, who have made it possible for the IIDS to host webinar series that could reflect on these very important policy issues. Let me now conclude by thanking you all for kindly accepting our invitation and attending today's event. The technology has made it possible for all of us sitting across the globe to come together to organize and participate in a virtual program with practically no financial cost. The next webinar will be held on 1st of February. The next session is also equally interesting, in which Mr. Maheshwar Shrestha, the economist in the World Bank, will be presenting his analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on Nepal's economy. I look forward to your participation in that event. Thank you very much. Now over to you,